The clock
In terms
inside the
of
Rayburn House
what
office
the
building has a way
investigation,
of mocking the
again,
people who
going back to
sit beneath it.
2008, Mr.
It
Acosta, who
ticks with a
limited the
mechanical
investigation
indifference to the
and limited
lives
the
being
search warrants and
dismantled in the
limited the
chairs
parameters
below,
of the
its
investigation.
hands
The only
sweeping
thing we
through
are
the
able to
hours
speak to
with a
publicly,
rhythmic,
because he was given a
cold precision
non-prosecution
that
agreement by
cares
Mr.
nothing for
Acosta,
legacy
is
or
that first time
ruin.
period from, I
On this
believe, don't
particular
quote me on this,
morning,
97 to
as the House
2001-ish.
Oversight Committee gathered
And
in a
then when the
room
Trump
thick with the scent
administration,
of
of
old
course,
paper
reopened
and
it.
expensive cologne, the time was 11:47 a.m. It was a moment that would eventually be etched into the ledger of political self-destruction, a timestamp for a tectonic shift in the American landscape. 17 minutes. That was the total duration of the collapse. For 17 minutes, Congresswoman Ilhan Omar had been the primary architect of her own spotlight, commanding the ornate chamber with the practiced, effortless poise of a rising star who believed the cameras were her ultimate shield. She was the hunter, the righteous prosecutor, the voice of a movement. And then, in a heartbeat, the atmosphere turned. It was the precise, agonizing second when the trap she hadn't realized she'd set for herself snapped shut with a soundless legal finality. FBI Director Kash Patel sat directly across from her at the witness table, his presence a masterclass in tactical stillness. While the room around him vibrated with the kinetic energy of a high-stakes hearing, Patel remained a study in quiet, almost unnerving composure. His hands were folded neatly over a bright red folder that sat on the mahogany surface like a dormant explosive. His expression was not merely calm, it was serene. He had the look of a man who had already seen the end of the movie, while everyone else in the theater was still buying popcorn and debating the plot. Omar, by contrast, was hunched forward, her body coiled like a spring, a phone pressed to her ear as her lawyer whispered into it with a frantic, rhythmic urgency that looked more like prayer than legal counsel. Around them, the grand room, with its vaulted ceilings and heavy drapery, had fallen into a silence so heavy it felt physical, a literal weight pressing down on the shoulders of everyone present. It wasn't the respectful, anticipatory quiet of a captivated audience waiting for a speech. It was the suffocating, frozen stillness that follows a high-speed collision on a crowded highway. That bridge of time between the impact and the scream. Outside those heavy doors, the world was vibrating. 47 million people were tethered to the live feed, a digital audience of unprecedented scale. The servers at C-SPAN were groaning and buckling under the weight of the traffic, and social media platforms were flickering in and out of existence as the sheer volume of global discourse crested into a digital flood. But in that room, the only thing that mattered was the look on Ilhan Omar's face. The script had been flipped. She was supposed to be the one tearing into the FBI director over alleged political witch hunts against the progressive left. Instead, she looked like a witness who had just realized her alibi was a lie, and that the exits were all locked from the outside. To truly understand the gravity of that singular moment of collapse, one has to look back at how the morning began, back when the air was still full of confidence, and the outcome felt entirely different. When Chairman Mike Johnson brought his gavel down 3 times, the sound was sharp and authoritative, echoing off the mahogany and marble with the finality of a starting gun. He declared the hearing in session, framing the day's business in the dry, bureaucratic language of congressional inquiry. They were there, he said, to look into FBI practices and the unsettling possibility that federal law enforcement was being weaponized to target sitting members of Congress. It was a premise that Omar had championed, a narrative she had spent weeks cultivating in the press. Seated alone at the witness table, stripped of the usual phalanx of press handlers, nervous aides, and protective staff, was Kash Patel. He had come prepared with a leather portfolio, a single glass of water, and an air of quiet readiness that felt more like a warning than a defense. When Johnson thanked him for appearing voluntarily, Patel adjusted his microphone with a steady, practiced hand. His voice, when it finally filled the room, was professional and level, the tone of a veteran who had navigated 1,000 such rooms and knew exactly where every loose floorboard was located. Then came Omar. She was a vision of absolute, unshakable confidence, dressed in a tailored black suit and a bold, vibrant purple hijab that seemed to draw all the light in the room toward her. Her eyes were narrowed, focused, and sharp. She had spent weeks sharpening her rhetorical knives for this specific encounter, viewing it as the defining moment of her career. She wasn't just there to ask questions. She was there to lead a crusade. Director Patel," she began, her voice cutting through the ambient hum of the room like a cold winter wind. "I'm going to get straight to it, because the American people deserve straight answers, and they have waited long enough for the truth." She paused, a seasoned performer giving the bank of cameras enough time to lock onto her expression and capture the righteous indignation in her gaze. She spoke with a poetic cadence about whistleblowers and credible reports. She spoke of progressive members, Muslims, and people of color being followed, monitored, and harassed by the very institution that Patel led. She framed the entire conflict as a battle between truth-tellers and a shadowy, oppressive state that used its power to silence dissent. It was a powerful opening, a narrative built for the evening news and the viral clips that would surely follow. "So, let me start with a simple question," she said, leaning in so far that she was nearly hovering over the table. "Yes or no, is the FBI currently investigating any sitting member of Congress?" Patel didn't blink. He didn't glance at a lawyer for guidance, nor did he check his notes. He looked her directly in the eye with a terrifying lack of hesitation. "Yes, Congresswoman," he replied. The room inhaled collectively, a sudden sharp intake of breath that sounded like a vacuum. Audible gasps rippled through the gallery, where activists and journalists sat perched on the edges of their seats. In the back of the room, a Republican member's muffled profanity was caught by a hot mic, a brief burst of raw reaction in a scripted world. Omar, however, allowed herself a small, triumphant smile. She thought she had him. She thought she had secured a confession of political persecution on live television, a smoking gun that would prove her narrative of a biased FBI targeting its political enemies. "And how many of those investigations target Muslim or progressive members?" she pressed, her voice rising with the momentum of the moment, sensing that she was on the verge of a historic victory. Patel remained unruffled, his voice a calm anchor in the rising storm. "Some of the individuals under investigation identify as progressive. Some identify as Muslim. But, Congresswoman, I need to clarify something very important about the nature of these files." "Yes or no answers, Director," Omar snapped, cutting him off with a sharp wave of her hand. She didn't want context. She wanted a headline. She launched into a blistering monologue about political targeting, the chilling of free speech, and the FBI's historical role in silencing voices of dissent. She was riding the wave of her own rhetoric, building a case for the cameras. "Context matters in law," Patel said, his voice acting as a scalpel, firm, precise, and impossible to ignore. "You asked for yes or no. I gave you yes. May I now provide the context that the law requires?" Omar waved her hand with a dismissive, airy flick, a gesture of supreme confidence. "You can provide it after you answer my questions. Director, have you personally authorized surveillance on any member of this committee?" 3 rows back in the gallery, Omar's lawyer was shaking his head, with a desperation that bordered on physical pain. He was leaning forward, his face pale, mouthing a silent no, a frantic, unspoken warning to stay away from that door. He could see the cliff that his client was walking toward, but Omar was riding the high of what she perceived as a total victory. She didn't see the warning. She didn't see the cliff. She only saw the director sitting across from her, seemingly cornered. I don't personally authorize individual surveillances in the way you are suggesting, Patel explained with a clinical calmness. But I do review and approve recommendations from field offices when they meet the high probable cause standards established by federal law. So, to answer your question, if a member of this committee is currently under investigation, it is because career FBI agents, not political appointees, found evidence of potential federal crimes serious enough to warrant one. Omar let out a sharp, mocking scoff that echoed through the silent room. Potential federal crimes. That's a very convenient phrase, Director. Care to elaborate on what crimes you're accusing sitting members of Congress of committing? Or is this just more of the same vague intimidation we've come to expect? The room went graveyard quiet. The frantic clicking of laptop keys from the press gallery ceased entirely. Patel looked at her for a long, heavy beat, a silence that stretched until it felt like it might break. "Congresswoman," he said, his voice dropping to a tone that was almost gentle, "are you absolutely sure you want me to answer that question in open session, on live television?" It was the final exit ramp, the last chance to turn back before the point of no return. Her lawyer was halfway out of his seat, his eyes wide, trying to catch her eye. She trying to scream a warning without making a sound. But pride is a powerful, blinding drug. Omar had come to this room to dismantle Kash Patel's career. She couldn't show a flicker of doubt now. She couldn't retreat in front of the world. "Director Patel, I asked you a direct question. What crimes are you accusing members of Congress of? Answer the question." Patel nodded slowly, the deliberate movement of a man who had just been given permission to do something he was perfectly prepared for. He didn't look triumphant. He looked like a man performing a necessary, if unpleasant, duty. He signaled to an aide standing in the wings. Suddenly, the room was a blur of motion. Sealed red folders, each stamped with heavy black ink reading "Cleared for public session," were distributed with lightning speed to every member of the committee. The chaos broke out as members tore into the packets, the sound of ripping paper filling the air like dry leaves in a storm. Republicans stared at the contents in stunned, wide-eyed silence. Democrats scanned the pages with the frantic, desperate energy of people looking for a way out of a burning building. Omar's hands began to shake as she broke the seal on her own folder. It was just a tremor at first, a slight vibration in her fingers, but in the unforgiving, high-definition clarity of the C-SPAN cameras, it looked like an earthquake. Her face, which had been vibrant and full of color, began to drain of its life. "What you're looking at," Patel's voice boomed through the rustle of paper, commanding the room's attention, "are redacted summaries of 3 ongoing FBI investigations into campaign finance violations, wire fraud, and potential Foreign Agents Registration Act violations involving current House members. These summaries have been cleared by the Department of Justice and the Office of Government Ethics specifically for this hearing, at your request for transparency." "This is highly irregular," Omar cried, her voice cracking, the high notes of her indignation replaced by a thin, sharp edge of panic. "You can't just distribute active investigation files to a public committee." "Congresswoman Omar," Patel interrupted, his voice turning sharp, clinical, and devastatingly cold. "You called this hearing. You demanded transparency. You summoned me here to answer for these investigations and accuse the Bureau of political bias. I am providing exactly what you demanded. Or would you prefer we stop now and reconvene in a secure facility. I just say the word, and we will move to a closed session. She was cornered in a way that left no room for maneuver. If she retreated now, she looked guilty of hiding the very truth she claimed to seek. If she stayed, she was walking deeper into the dark. She chose to stand her ground, though the steel had visibly left her voice. "I have nothing to hide, Director," she said, her words sounding hollow even to herself. "Let's continue. But I want to be clear, for the record. This seems like a highly coordinated, politically motivated attack." "May I ask you a question?" Patel asked. Omar blinked, momentarily thrown by the shift in dynamic. This is my question time, Director. I ask the questions here." "Of course." "Then let me answer your original question more specifically," Patel said, opening his own folder with a slow, deliberate grace. "Let's start with case file 2021DC4478. It involves a series of complex transactions totaling $2.7 million in campaign expenditures paid directly to a consulting firm owned by an individual with whom the candidate allegedly had an undisclosed, long-term personal relationship. He began to detail a formal complaint filed by the National Legal and Policy Center, an organization that alleged campaign funds were being systematically diverted for personal expenses, potentially constituting wire fraud on a massive scale. "Director," Omar stammered, her face turning a ghostly shade of pale that made her purple hijab look even more stark. Are you discussing my campaign? Are you bringing my personal life into this hearing?" Patel looked at her with a clinical detachment, the look a scientist might give a specimen under a lens. "Sure, Congresswoman. You asked what crimes we investigate. I'm giving you a specific, concrete example of the work the Bureau does. If the details sound familiar to you, it's because they are drawn directly from public records, financial disclosures, and documents obtained through a lawful, multi-year investigative process." The air in the room seemed to vanish, leaving everyone gasping. Republican James Jordan leaned in, his eyes narrowed as he smelled blood in the water. "Director Patel," he said, his voice cutting through the tension, "just to clarify for the record. Is Congresswoman Omar currently the subject of an active FBI investigation? Congressman, as you know, I cannot confirm the identity of subjects in ongoing investigations without specific DOJ approval for each name," Patel replied, his voice a shield of bureaucratic precision. "What I can say for the record is that case file 2021 DC4478 involves a sitting House member representing Minnesota's 5th Congressional District. There was only one person in that room, and only one person in the entire Congress, who fit that description." Omar's knuckles were white, her hands gripping the edge of the mahogany table as if it were the only thing keeping her from falling. "This is outrageous!" she shouted, though the volume lacked its earlier power. "You're using this hearing, which was meant to hold you accountable, to smear me with baseless allegations. I'm simply answering your questions with the facts as they exist in our files," Patel said. "Would you like me to stop?" The silence that followed was agonizing, a long, drawn-out moment of pure tension. Omar looked at her lawyer. He was shaking his head with a frantic, arrhythmic intensity. "Stop. Stop now. Cut your losses." But the world was watching. The cameras were still rolling. If she stopped now, it was a silent admission of everything he was implying. She took a ragged, shaky breath and tried to find her voice again. "Fine, Director. Let's talk specifics, if you're so intent on this. Campaign spending is legal. Hiring consultants is a standard part of every political operation. What is the actual allegation here? Where is the crime?" Patel didn't just answer. He began a forensic autopsy of her financial history. He signaled to the technicians, and a series of charts and timelines appeared on the monitors for everyone in the room to see. He showed how payments to a firm called E Street Group, owned by Tim Minot, had started at a relatively modest $15,000 a month in 2018. Then, and with a flick of his finger, he showed how they spiked to $64,000, then $180,000, and continued to climb as the relationship between the two became the subject of public speculation. Then came the hammer, delivered with the quiet force of a falling mountain. He mentioned Dr. Beth Jordan Minot, the wife of the firm's owner, filing for divorce in a public court. He noted that she had cited her husband's affair with a named individual as the primary cause for the dissolution of their marriage. "She named you, Congresswoman," Patel said, his voice echoing in the stillness. "That is a private matter," Omar shouted, her voice reaching a pitch of desperation. "My personal life has no place in this hearing," Patel continued as if she hadn't spoken, his focus remaining entirely on the documents in front of him. He pointed to the month immediately following the public filing of the divorce. "Your campaign paid E Street Group $275,000 in a single 30-day period. $250,000 of donor money went to the company owned by the man you were allegedly having an affair with at the time." He then compared her spending to other progressive campaigns of similar size and scope. While her peers spent an average of $47,000 for an entire election cycle on similar services, Omar had funneled a staggering $890,000 to E Street Group over the same period. "We spent months looking for documentation of services rendered that would justify those amounts," Patel said. "We couldn't find them. So we dug deeper. Of that $275,000 payment I just mentioned, our tracing shows that $100,000 went directly into a personal LLC in Tim Minot's name. Or another $75,000 went to a luxury travel company to cover a 3-week vacation to the Maldives. And $50,000 went to an escrow company as a down payment on a luxury townhouse in Georgetown, a property that is now owned jointly by you and Mr. Minot." You could have heard a pin drop on the thick carpet of the hearing room. The weight of the numbers seemed to crush the air out of the room. "Were any of those expenditures related to campaign activities, Congresswoman?" Patel asked, his voice now almost curious. "Did the donors to your campaign know they were funding a Georgetown townhouse and a vacation to the Maldives?" Omar's lawyer stood up, desperate to confer with his client, his face a mask of panic. Chairman Johnson immediately ordered him to sit down, gaveling him into silence. Omar looked at her attorney, her eyes wide and searching, but he simply shook his head. There was no escape. The evidence was on the screen, documented and traced. "I would need to review those specific transactions with my financial team," Omar whispered, her voice barely audible. "So, for the record," Patel said, letting the words hang in the air for maximum impact, "you cannot explain where $250,000 of your campaign funds went, other than to the man you eventually married." But Patel wasn't finished. He hadn't even reached the midpoint of his presentation. He moved from campaign finance to her tax returns, turning the pages of his red folder with a slow, methodical click. He brought up the tax years 2014 and 2015, showing documents where Omar had filed jointly with a man named Ahmed Hirsi. Then, with the timing of a master storyteller, he produced a marriage certificate from 2009. It showed that she was legally married to a different man, Ahmed Nur Said Elmi, and that this marriage remained legally binding until 2017. "How did you file joint federal tax returns with one man while you were still legally married to another?" Patel asked. "It's a simple question of math and law. It was a cultural marriage," Omar stammered, the explanation sounding weak and flimsy in the face of the official documents on the screen. Our community has different traditions regarding "you're either married or you're not under the laws of the United States," Patel countered, his voice firming up. The Internal Revenue Service does not recognize cultural nuances that contradict legal status. See, if you filed taxes claiming marriage to one person while legally married to another to gain a financial or legal advantage, that's perjury. That's a federal crime. The revelations kept coming like waves during a brutal storm, each one more devastating than the last. He moved on to the subject of immigration fraud, citing evidence that the marriage to Elmi may have been a sham designed specifically to secure his permanent residency in the United States. He cited witness statements from people within the community who said Omar and Elmi never lived as a couple, never shared a home, and that Omar had explicitly stated to associates that the marriage was for his papers. Omar sat frozen, a statue of herself, her eyes fixed on a point somewhere behind Patel's head. She was no longer the hunter. She was the prey. Then came the final folder. This one was different from the others. It was thinner, marked with a classification level that required special clearance and handled with a different kind of care. Patel began to speak of a trip to Istanbul in 2017 and a series of meetings with high-level Qatari officials. He pointed out that shortly after these meetings, Omar's rhetoric on the House floor shifted dramatically to favor Qatari interests, while she remained conspicuously silent on their well-documented human rights abuses. He noted $187,000 in donations from interests closely tied to the Qatari government that flowed into her orbit in the months that followed. "There's a law called the Foreign Agents Registration Act," Patel said. "It requires anyone working on behalf of a foreign power to disclose that relationship to the government. Did you register as a foreign agent?" "Congresswoman! I'm a United States Congresswoman," she cried, a final flare of her old defiance. "I don't work for anyone but the people of Minnesota." "The two aren't mutually exclusive," Patel said calmly, his voice cold and steady. He then placed his own phone on the table in front of him. "The FBI obtained a series of encrypted WhatsApp messages between you and a Qatari intermediary. They discuss, and I will quote the transcript here, compensation for advocacy on Gulf policy issues and the timing of specific floor statements." Omar had stopped breathing. Her face went from ashen to a deathly, translucent white. She flipped to page 47 of the folder she was holding, her eyes darting over the highlighted text, as if searching for a way to make the words disappear. The silence in the room stretched for 10 seconds, then 20, then 30, and it was a silence that felt like a funeral. "Congresswoman," Patel said, his voice now almost hauntingly soft, echoing in the stillness of the chamber, "are you invoking your Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination?" It was 11:47 a.m. The moment hit like a physical blow to the stomach. Every person in that room, every journalist in the gallery, and every person watching at home knew what that meant. They knew that while the Fifth Amendment is a fundamental constitutional right, in the brutal arena of public opinion and political survival, it is a confession written in stone. "On the advice of my counsel," Omar whispered, her voice shaking so violently it was hard to understand her, "regarding the specific questions about the Qatar meetings, yes, I'm invoking my Fifth Amendment rights." The room detonated into absolute chaos. Journalists scrambled for the exits to file their stories. Republicans were shouting over one another, calling for immediate action. Democrats were huddled in frantic groups, calling for an emergency recess. Camera flashes turned the room into a strobe light, capturing the wreckage of a career in frantic, flickering bursts. Chairman Johnson hammered his gavel until it sounded like gunfire. But order was a memory. The hearing was over, even if the cameras were still rolling. Kash Patel simply closed his red folder. He didn't smile. He didn't look triumphant. He looked almost sad, like a doctor who had done everything he could for a patient who had stubbornly refused the cure. He leaned into the microphone one last time, his voice cutting through the noise. "Invoking the Fifth is your absolute right as an American citizen," he said. But as a courtesy, I must inform you that the Department of Justice has been monitoring this hearing in real time. Given the testimony and the documents presented today, they will likely request an expedited review of all aspects of case file 2021DC4478. The hearing fell into a chaotic recess, and with it, a political career ended. There was no coming back from 11:47 a.m. The aftermath was a blur of high-velocity political carnage. Omar was whisked away through a human shield of panicked staffers into a waiting black SUV, but she couldn't outrun the internet. The image of her face at 11:47 a.m., that mask of sudden total realization, became the defining meme of the year, a visual shorthand for the fall from grace. By 3 p.m. that same day, her defiant press releases, full of talk about Islamophobia and political targeting, it were landing with the heavy thud of wet cardboard. No one was buying the narrative anymore. Even her closest allies in the squad were retreating into vague, carefully worded statements about the importance of due process and the presumption of innocence. Nancy Pelosi's office offered nothing more than a diplomatic shrug and a comment about the seriousness of the allegations. By the third day, the House Ethics Committee had opened a formal investigation. By Thursday, 67 members of her own party had joined with Republicans in a historic vote to strip her of all her committee assignments. 3 weeks later, the Department of Justice held a somber press conference in front of a forest of microphones. They didn't even need to say her name at first. They just started reading the counts. A long, rhythmic list of legal failures: wire fraud, making false statements to federal agents, tax perjury, immigration conspiracy, and multiple violations of the Foreign Agents Registration Act. 51 counts in total. The sheer scale of the indictment was breathtaking. The political world, as it always does, moved on with ruthless speed. A primary challenger emerged from within her own district, a local leader who promised a return to service rather than stardom. The donors who had once flocked to her vanished overnight. A major book deal was canceled by the publisher. A documentary that had been years in the making was shelved indefinitely. She became a ghost in the halls of power she had once sought to dominate. Kash Patel never took a victory lap. He didn't do the Sunday talk show circuit or write an op-ed about his triumph. He just went back to the bureau and got back to work. To him, the day hadn't been about the person. It had been about the documents. It had been about the paper trail that never lies, no matter how good the storyteller is. Months later, a senior staffer who had been in the room that day reflected on the events in a quiet, dimly lit coffee shop away from the Capitol. "Did Kash know?" I asked. "Did he know she'd walk right into it?" The staffer smiled over the rim of their coffee cup, a knowing, tired smile. Kash Patel has been a prosecutor, a public defender, and a national security official. He spent his entire life studying how people work, how they break, and how they lie. When Omar demanded that hearing, his team didn't spend their time preparing a defense. They didn't look for excuses. They prepared disclosures. And they built those red folders like a legal brief, brick by brick, fact by fact. He knew her better than she knew herself. He knew that her pride wouldn't let her back down. He knew she'd ask for transparency because she thought it was her weapon. The staffer leaned back, the memory of that morning still vivid and sharp in their mind. Omar thought transparency meant exposing her enemy to the world, they said. She thought the light would only shine on him. She didn't realize that transparency is a mirror, and if you don't like what's standing behind you, you should never ask for a better look. In the end, she brought a narrative to a gunfight, but he brought the receipts,